Most organizations were checking the box or feeling like, oh, we have to do this. I don't want to do this, which then became this almost a perspective of we're doing something wrong.
It's a leader's responsibility to set the tone and standards in the workplace, and strong leaders lead by example.
It takes vulnerability to put your arm around someone because you're exposing yourself. It takes action, and that authentic action to be vulnerable is what leads to empathy. A greater majority of employees feel more engaged when their leader cares, when their leader demonstrates empathy, is in it with them. At the same point, leaders, when you're showing active empathy, the morale of everyone increases. Welcome to the Impact Driven Leader Podcast with me, your host, Tyler Dickerhoff. Today, it's a solo episode, but I'm joined by my friend Alex, my producer, Alex Kushner. Welcome in, Alex. This is the first official podcast that you have been a guest on. Yes. You and I both have Monday Newswire that we host together. Each Monday, we talk about current news. We're going to do a little bit of that today, but this is more overarching as we're going to talk about the top leadership trends of 2025. So if you're listening, if you're watching, hi. Alex obviously has his Santa hat on. Yep. Very festive. I am adorned in my all black as usual. But we're going to go through some of the key trends that we see that we've recognized that have kind of come up, for me, honestly, in some discussions, key leadership trends of 2025. So I'm excited to kick it off and get into it.
Yeah. And, I know you have some exciting events coming up, just around the corner, and you want to just mention some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So here in the month of December, if you're listening in, we will close applications the end of January. If you're listening after that, that's okay. You can still be a part of the community in a lot of different ways. But my signature coaching, my signature community piece, the roundtable, we're taking applications for. You can go to impactdrivenleader.com where you can find access to apply for that. It's a small cohort group where we meet weekly on Zoom from February through the end of November. And we walk through the framework, the Awaken the Leader Within framework as well. We'll go through a little bit of book study. We're moving into the 5th year, have a lot of returning alumni. And I was just talking to one yesterday and he goes, I didn't understand how much I needed this and how much I've gotten out of it. This will absolutely be a piece of my ongoing leadership development. So that was from Kyle and fortunate to have him as a part of the community. So you can apply for that. Again, impactdrivenleader.com. It is the roundtable. Part of the roundtable is you will get a ticket, a VIP ticket valued at just under $2,000 itself for the Impact Summit 2025, which is May 7th and 8th, 2025 in Spokane, Washington. You're going to want to be there. It's awesome. Very much like the roundtable where we're in small tables where we're, connecting and meeting with others, sharing what we're learning. Last year we had speakers John Maxwell, Graham Cochran, Katie Casada, Jake Thompson. Amazing content. We're going to have just as good of content this next year. I know it absolutely. So that's the Impact Driven Leader Summit on May 7th and 8th. You can go to impactdrivenleadersummit.com to purchase tickets for that event. So that's what we got going on.
Super exciting.
Alex, let's jump in. And let's go through the topics. I'm going to give you an outline so you can hear what we have coming. We'll obviously discuss it. But the first one, and this is a list of 6 trends. We have maybe a bonus 7th. We'll see how we get to that. But the first trend, and I'm going to list them off, is the end of DEI. Yeah, it's happening. Number 2, resurgence of accountability. Number 3, vulnerability, authenticity, and empathy. That's a key facet to the Impact-Driven Leader framework. The next is the return to in-person work. We're seeing that over and over. Next, culture is king. I believe that's a caveat we're going to see more and more. And then multi-generational leadership, which is really showing up as massive organizational change. Those are the 6th. I'll tease the 7th, resilience and mental health. I think that's been a trend, but that will continue So, Alex, let's jump into the first one here. You brought up some stats in regards to the end of DEI. I'd love for you to share that with the audience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's been a trend. And as you've seen, across many news articles and news outlets, this year, a lot of big companies are ending their DEI programs or completely transforming them because it has been ineffective. And in a Deloitte survey, and this was done in 2023, so just last year, 41% of leaders found that DEI efforts are ineffective due to basically not, lack of tangible results. So I think if you're in this position, you really, if you haven't already, have to see what the results have been and if they've not been effective. And Tyler, you've had multiple guests on, this past year talking about this, DEI experts. Can you highlight what those experts told you?
Yeah. Yeah. So I go back to the first person who kind of really brought this subject to the forefront, Gil Winch. So Gil Winch, the author of Winning with Underdogs. And in that, he shares a snippet and it talks about specifically DEI. And, what he shares about if there is a bouncer at the door, you're still exclusionary. The only way to not be exclusionary is tell the bouncer he's no longer got a job. Well, let me describe that organizationally. If you choose to say, we don't have enough people of a certain gender, a certain belief system, a certain history, ethnic, whatever it may be, and we're going to choose to select those people at the expense of selecting others, well, you're still exclusionary. And I think that's a key facet to this DEI mandate that's been put down. Is, to me at the heart, it's all good. Hey, let's make sure that we give, opportunities to all people, not specifically our bias. Unfortunately, by doing that, we turned against people that weren't necessarily doing anything wrong that fit into the structure of what our bias was. If you were a white male and that's what our bias was, now all of a sudden, oh, we're not going to select those. They are the problem. One of my most recent guests, Kendra Mack, and she's going to show up here in 2025 as a guest, and who is a DEI trainer, and talked about it. It's like the problem is we went into it all the wrong way. Instead of talking about strengths and values and uniqueness and the value of having people that have the same values but a different makeup background gives us such a different perspective, we went into it from the standpoint of, oh, if you look like this, you're wrong. We have to have more people that look differently. And I think that's why we're seeing the end of DEI, because it really has created a narrative that's just as toxic that people don't want to be a part of as all the good. And so the good, to me, got overshadowed by the negative, I'm going to force it down your throat. You have to accept this, instead of saying, hey, I think many people would agree. It's like, do whatever you want to do. But when you come to work, do the work. And I think that's the other point that has been lost many times is the meritocracy, the ability to conduct the actual business is lost because, oh, we can't fire this person because it'll look bad because of their race, their alignment, their gender, ethnicity, as opposed to they're not doing the job.
For those listening, I mean, this is happening at some of the biggest employers in the country: Walmart, Boeing, Harley Davidson, Ford Motors, Tractor Supply, and just to name a few. Like, this is not, at local places. These are
major organizations. I think what it is it's also given credence to people that are saying, hey, we understand we need to be more diverse, but let's go about it in the right way. I think this comes back to a facet of leadership. Everyone has value. And if you see that everyone has value, you end up quickly being blind to a lot of their outward, what they are outwardly. You start to look at it, it's like, hey, we value and I think a big part of it is part of this trend is moving away from quote unquote DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion, and moving to values based. This is what's important. What are your values? And let's really talk and describe and align to values, because ultimately that's what's going to lead us forward, and not just by trying to put more people of a certain race, alignment, or whatever else into seats and thinking we're going to become a better outward facing organization.
Yeah, and that was the initial term. It was to promote the idea of increasing, diversity in recruitment and hiring, and broadening, minorities into higher roles and to better roles, and helping them succeed and climb the leadership ranks. And it's really, I feel like it like morphed, like it became
Well,
something
what
different.
happened is came in with good intentions. Hey, make everyone feel comfortable and welcome, and let's make sure we educate so people are welcoming. But as I talk to friends that have gone through it, as I've talked to DEI presenters, they say most organizations were checking the box or feeling like, oh, we have to do this. I don't want to do this, which then became this almost a perspective of we're doing something wrong. So when we go about DEI and we try to correct the ills, what we inadvertently do is start to tell people what they've been doing is wrong. Now, there may be some people bad practices, but someone showing up every day and saying, I'm wrong because I'm a white male, man, that's something I can't change. My wife says this, and I appreciate it. I think it fits into this. If someone can't change whatever that circumstance is in 15 minutes, then don't talk about it. That's unfair. And I think that's where DEI went wrong, because so many people felt like I've done nothing wrong. And yet I'm constantly being pointed at and saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. Instead of, hey, let's identify what is good, what's good in our situation, and let's perpetuate that. And I think that many organizations are now finding themselves into this place of accountability, which leads into trend number two, which is the resurgence of accountability. And I think that goes hand in hand with the failure of DEI, because now we're choosing to be accountable and saying this directive from special interests, which wasn't all wrong, we went about it wrong. It became I would use the term witch hunt,
Yeah,
because I think that's appropriate. And instead of like, no, let's be accountable. What
yeah.
are we trying to do? Who do we serve? What are the interests of people that we serve? And if we're actively in an organization that are telling people, hey, we're trying to check the box on DEI, and you've said no, we don't want that. Well, we need to be accountable to our customers. And I think the one trend has led directly into the next one of the resurgence of accountability. I know you got some stats there on accountability.
Yeah, and I was going to get into those stats real quick, but also, so in Harvard, I'll just read the stats first, and I want to go into this Nike article. But Harvard Business Review this year reported that teams with strong accountability systems saw 22% improvement in productivity, and accounting is increasingly linked to trust, with 80% of employees valuing clear, consistent feedback. And I have an article, from Forbes about Nike. So Nike hasn't had a good year. It's been tough for Nike. Had major leadership change and really a crisis internally. And they said it's a leader's responsibility to set the tone and standards in the workplace, and strong leaders lead by example. The right leadership can help build an optimized workplace culture where everyone is invested in the organization's growth. And all of this is so correlated and interconnected. This top list, and it's staggering that if you can be accountable, trustworthy, how much productivity increases.
Well, we see that going on in the political landscape. We have, a new elected president, and one of the big facets, I think, of his administration is accountability. Accountability to what actually people care and are focused on, as opposed to being told, oh, this is important. And you're like, I don't think that's affecting my everyday. And so that accountability going into organizations as well, it comes back to if we can't do the job our customer wants, but we look good on the outside, we're not that good. And I think Nike has seen that. They've been one of the organizations that, maybe has tried to, go a direction of, oh, this is what's good for the world. And yet their customer base is saying, no, quit trying to force that on us. I think then internally, their employee base is saying, no, this doesn't work for us. I had a conversation with a friend this morning. We were talking about these trends, and just making sure that I was on point. And one of the things that we discussed was this very thing about accountability and how so much of the collective bargaining and union structure has made it so difficult within organizations to practice accountability. There are so many steps in the process of accountability that I think it leads to leaders practicing one of the major barriers in leadership that I identify, which is inactivity. I don't want to hold Alex accountable because if I hold Alex accountable, it's going to be a fight with the union rep. And so I've spent 27 hours actually trying to hold you accountable, which should have been and could have been a 10 to 15 minute conversation. And we both come out of it, we shake hands, we clap, and we move on down the road. That is this resurgence of accountability that needs to get fixed in organizations that you point to exactly of the strong accountability systems, 22% increase in productivity. I also believe it's this. When I, as a leader, know it's wrong and I don't hold someone accountable, then my actions have said, I'm okay with that. And that degrades trust, as you pointed out, with the 80% of employees valuing clear, consistent feedback. They just want to know where we're going, what's going on.
And this trickles down, from the top down. If you're a middle management person, you're still managing people, you have that same effect on, the 20, 30, 50, 100 people that you're managing in your specific area. And sometimes you have to be that change, right? It may not be coming from the top. So now, if you're watching the show and you do manage people, like, you can take these things and start the change within your organization or whoever your employer is.
I think it was over the weekend. My family, we were together, and one of my kids or my wife, somebody brought up, was like, who do you think the best 3 leaders of all time are? And one of them identified was Mahatma Gandhi. And what's interesting is I heard this quote from him this morning, is be the change that you want to see in the world. And I think where we're going to, and we've seen this, it's been very difficult to stand against the trends in our society. You've been shunned, you've been ostracized. Going back into the DEI, if you stand against it and say, hey, I'm okay with people that have a different belief, that's cool. But don't tell me that I have to live that way in order to be viewed as equal. Go live how you want. I'm going to choose to live how I want. You're asking for acceptance. I want acceptance too. And I think this same in leadership, we're now starting to say, that's wrong. I'm not going to stand for it. I'm going to hold people accountable. And if that means I lose my job, then fine, I shouldn't be here anyways. And we're starting to see that exercise because people are fed up with the lack of accountability. All right. Let's lead into trend number 3.
I think it's totally, total connection here.
Trend number 3, authenticity, vulnerability. Let me go back. Vulnerability, authenticity, and empathy will have a greater place in organizations. I just recently did a presentation, part of my content developing. And what I understood is leaders that lack accountability, struggle with accountability, really have a problem being vulnerable. And it's because their vulnerability means they have to own and accept failure. And so many leaders don't want to own and accept failure, which ties into their lack of authenticity, which makes empathy impossible.
Yeah, I was going to say, listen to this. Listen to this stat. Gallup study, this 2024, found that 70%, 70% of employees are more engaged when their leaders demonstrate empathy.
Yeah.
That's like almost everybody.
I think one thing for me to understand, and I've seen this in so many different ways, I came up with my own description or definition of empathy. And the more times that I read about empathy, see empathy, as we've just discussed it, vulnerability and authenticity, I describe empathy as putting your arms around someone and walking with them. I recently heard from John Maxwell, and he talks about 4 traits of a leader. And one of those traits is connection. And he talks about connection as a leader is walking beside someone. I'd go to the extent, and I even have an image, a picture, an example of John doing that with me, where he has his arm around me and my wife, and we're walking. And it's him pouring into both of us. To me, that's the example of empathy. It takes vulnerability to put your arm around someone because you're exposing yourself. It takes action. And that authentic action to be vulnerable is what leads to empathy.
I've been to those John Maxwell events. You've invited me. I've been to two, I believe. And the morale and the energy of all the people that are working at that event, not the attendees, the people that are working for Maxwell leadership, everyone's so positive and happy and cheery, and it's all because of John. And I think for those people listening, this is also from the Gallup study. If you have that problem with like morale boosting, it's probably because of you. And it's in this study, it said authentic leadership improves team morale by over 33% on average. On average. So that's probably most likely going to boost it even more than 33%.
One of the key pieces of the framework, the work that I've had to work through, Gallup had they were partners, Clifton Strengths. It's a separate group, but it's similar. And they identify strengths. And I took that several years ago. And one of the traits that I was identified as having a low strength was empathy. Now, one of the things that I understood at that point, and as I've identified myself, we struggle with empathy when we're unwilling to be authentic or vulnerable. And usually we struggle with authenticity and vulnerability when we're overcome and overwhelmed by our insecurities. And as you're listening in, I want you to hear this. It's okay. Because every person who's living and breathing in the world has and struggles with their insecurities. I'm one, and it shows up in different ways. And for me, it shows up when I'm intense and maybe I'm not real empathetic. But you know what? When my insecurity is at bay, I can show up as vulnerable and authentic and empathetic. And I just encourage you, if you find yourself at points where you're frustrated, you feel lost, hey, send me a message, send me a DM. I'd love to share with you the framework, the Awaken the Leader Within framework that I've worked through and identified has helped me and so many others as part of my community come to grips and understand their insecurity first and foremost, but then how it's affecting others. And then the process to change your beliefs and your thoughts of why that insecurity has such a stronghold, because you're exactly right. When you said earlier, and identifying the Gallup figures, is employees, overwhelmingly, a greater majority of employees feel more engaged when their leader cares, when their leader demonstrates empathy, is in it with them. At the same point, leaders, when you're showing active empathy, the morale of everyone, your family, your people's families increases. That's the great opportunity and ultimate strength of a leader, is being vulnerable. And sometimes it's difficult. Now, I want to say I'm with you. I've been there. I've gone through it, and I've seen the carnage of my insecurity at play. And I know there's a path forward.
What do we got? Shifting, because this is a little shifting now to number 4 on the list.
I'd say shift, but it's connected. And part of that is it's so hard, and I think it's been so hard the last 4 or 5 years for leaders to be empathetic because they haven't been in person. And it takes a different skill set to be empathetic over a screen than it does in person. So the trend number 4 that I identified is in person is the way. All right. Now, don't hear that wrong. Don't sit here and listen in and think, oh, Tyler's saying it has to be return to the office. The only way you can work with people is in the office. Like, no. My wife and I have an organization that we lead thousands of people that's highly successful, and it's all remote. I work with you remote, Alex. I work with my assistant, Emily, remote. We're all work from home and we do different things. But I know this. You and I have had the opportunity to be face-to-face in person a couple times since we've worked together last year. I've done the same with Emily. I've done the same with other people. And I know from my experience in my network marketing organization and business that you can have phenomenal relationships and get a lot of work done remotely on your own. But there is something magical and special, and it comes back to empathy. It comes back to connectedness, is when you find yourself in person. And I think one of the keys here, and I think you're going to support this with some facts, is you can work hybrid, but man, you better find time and schedule in time to be in person. And I will share this, is that time in person doesn't have to be about work. It can just be proximity of being close to each other. Go ahead, Alex.
I wanted to do this when I had my agency. I had an agency 4 years ago. We had about 20 employees, and I wanted to bring them back in the office like the year after COVID. Boy, this is in California. Did not work because I felt that way. I truly felt that if I could have everyone back in, we can get the energy back, we can get people remotivated, creative, because it was a very creative place. And they just it wasn't the right time. Now, thank God I do, because I really believe in this. I do believe that problem solving, creativity, it's just different when you're with someone in that room. And again, I agree with the hybrid model. I think it's just regular, consistent human interaction is key. And the data supports it. McKinsey did a study just this year, found that 62% of employees feel more productive in a hybrid model with regular, and this is key, regular in-person interactions. So it has to be consistently in person to help, increase that number, which I 100% agree with. And then offices that focus on collaboration spaces saw a 40% improvement in creativity and problem solving. The data supports that this is the path forward. And Amazon, we spoke about this earlier in the year. They just shifted their policies, and many other companies are going to do the same. Amazon, probably the biggest employer in the country. I believe them and Walmart.
Patagonia was another one that we identified. I think one of the pieces here to focus on is there's no best way, but there's best practices. Meaning you can have a phenomenal organization that is 100% remote. You can have individuals that maybe are at their best when it's remote. But I will contend this is if you have an opportunity to get together in person at some point, that connectedness is going to enhance overall productivity. And I believe it really comes to this is when, it's said, I forget exactly who said it. It might have been Churchill, Disraeli, one of those English prime ministers. I may be wrong. And if I'm quoting this wrong, please send me the message so I can properly note it, is people don't care until they know how much you care, right? And when you are able to be with someone in person and really show you care, well, then they care more. And I think that's a real facet of this in person. It isn't the way, but there are some best practices. Are you spending time to walk through the crowd slowly and get to know people? I remember shortly after COVID, I was talking to a friend of mine who was an executive vice president of a very large Midwestern company. They sold fertilizer. They did a lot of other farming products, and a very large organization, several thousand people. And he was working corporately in their office, and he was talking about how difficult it was to lead people because they were no longer in their office. And coming from a business where I had worked on the road, I didn't have an office space. I understand both. I said to him, friend, Steve, that's an excuse. Like it's been easy to walk down the hallway to see somebody at lunch and just interact. Now you got to be intentional about it. And I think the intentionality of in person is what's really important. So I stress, you've seen the instances of being in person with some of the communities that I have, in that intentionality of I am going to make sure people are seen and they know I care about them, but be authentic and vulnerable about that. Man, that's so important. And I think as we see organizations that figure this dynamic out, the ones that embrace the best practices of the proximity, of walking with people, of caring about them and their organization, whether they work remote or not, will build the best cultures that people want to be a part of. Which leads me to trend number 5. You would think somebody organized this. I didn't organize this. Alex, you organized this so seamlessly. Number 5 trend is culture is king.
I was going to ask you, How do you define culture? You personally.
It's great. Culture is the environment and the circumstances by which people act and engage with in an organization. I learned from my friend Jake Thompson. He when he spoke at the Impact Driven Leader Summit back in 2024, he also went on to do another private event for a group of football coaches, football program in the area. And he shared this, and it's so profound. Said you don't have a strong or weak culture. All cultures are equally strong. They're equally strong. It is what it is. They're all equally strong. He said the difference is you either have a positive or negative culture. And I think when you start to understand, okay, I see what that means. Now I can either, going back to the accountability piece, if I fall into inactivity as a leader, then I'm allowing for a negative culture to perpetuate. You could also have a positive culture that someone really enhances the intentionality, the care about people, the empathy, someone else. But as a leader, you're just kind of along for the ride. And here's what happens eventually is the leader who's along for the ride, who wants to just kind of step away, to step back, to not take accountability, be vulnerable, they'll eventually find themselves as a part of an organization, leading an organization that they're looking around and saying, I don't want to be here. And I think that's where this thought and idea that culture is king kind of takes each one of these points that we've brought up thus far and brings them to a pinnacle of you're either leading the ship or it's leading you. And if you want to understand that your best way to support your employees is to steer the ship, have a culture that you love and embrace, that loves and embraces customers and your employees, that's where people are going to want to work.
To support that with some facts and some data, it's like, all right, you take a culmination of all these trends we've been talking about, right? Everything we've been mentioning thus far. And if you can craft a positive culture, you can see, this is from LinkedIn Talent Solutions, a study they just did, that companies with a positive, strong culture see 4x in revenue growth. And so if you're making 10 million a year, you could see 40 million plus a year. This is a lot of money. Or if you're a coach and you have 2 wins, you're talking about an 8-win season. I mean, this is huge. This is going from the biggest loser in your conference to potentially going to the playoffs, or from a $100 million business to a 400, maybe even $1 billion valuation. These are massive. 4x. If you can 4x something by creating this strong culture, you're changing your life and many people's lives by doing that, or a team, a winning organization. I think that's just really powerful by just that shift in culture creation.
One of the things that I believe to be true is in so many organizations, teams, is that the culture determines the outcome more than the strategy. And one great example of that, and I'm a Cleveland Browns fan. All right, a little sports directive here. But there's a coach. But I would even go beyond the coach. There's an ownership group that has done more to establish their culture and who they are than any other organization that I can think of off the top of my head. And that's the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Rooney family. The fact in over 60 years, they've only had 3 head coaches. Their current head coach, Mike Tomlin, has never had a losing season. I believe it's 17 years now. Maybe it's 15, 17 years, has never had a losing season. To me, that is all culture, and it starts at the top, and obviously it goes very much into the coach, and it all leads to results. It all leads to results. One of the speakers at the Impact Driven Leader Summit 2025, Jenny Catrone, she has a book coming out. It's called Culture Matters, a framework for helping your team grow, thrive, and be unstoppable. It's a book that she and I have talked a lot about in this idea in our friendship. She's been a guest previously on the Impact Driven Leader podcast. She'll be a guest again. Just wait for that. I also am speaking at her Culture Summit. We'll make sure that's in the show links if you want to come to that. It's a summit that you can click into. But really part of that is her, and we've talked about it, is culture is the divider. And instead of so many leaders over the last few years have been at the whim of whatever culture, as opposed to, no, I'm going to lead the culture. And part of leading the culture is saying, my culture isn't for everyone. It's for the people that have the same values, that adhere to the mission, that want to be a part of the bigger picture, that buy into the vision. And I think, and without having, all the framework from Jenny, but I think the leader that does a better job of being clear with their vision, staying accountable to it, connecting with people are going to influence the culture in a way that people decide either they fit in or they fit out.
And we're both football fans, right? I'm not going to talk about my New York Jets because they definitely don't fit that mold.
Well, they do. But because here's what I would say, is there an example contrary to the other example?
But who has, and if you don't follow football, that's fine. But Dan Campbell, he's the head coach.
He's done an amazing job.
Amazing. He's the head coach of the Detroit Lions. And for those that don't watch football, that's fine. Detroit Lions have been a losing organization for generations, forever. And this guy comes in and he is so everything that we've been talking about.
I would say unapologetic.
Unapologetic, real, honest, he lets his emotions, authenticity, but vulnerability. He is so vulnerable when he's talking to his players. He just lets his true self go in whether it's like a sadness or excitement, whatever. He is the epitome. He has turned around that organization, and I want to just shout that out because that is incredible.
Here's what I think is great, and again, we'll talk a second about sports. Sports can be multi-generational, and you have ownership group, executive group, coach, and players. And yet, one thing that I've found to be true, and this is, I've seen this over the last 10 or so years, about 10, 12 years ago, there was this deep conversation about how do you lead millennials? And one of the great challenges there I saw with millennials is they were kind of pushing against the established culture in organizations where it's, tenure is you got to stick around, you got to just bide your time. Eventually you'll get the opportunity. And they're like, no, I want it now. And part of it was the environment they were raised in, having more technology at the place, but also they were a bigger group. We had more millennials than we did Gen Xers. So they were able to eventually kind of say, hey, is this important? Yeah, this is important to me. And everyone went with it. Here's the other caveat to that, is what I learned through that process is what millennials were asking for, Gen Xers, baby boomers, they all wanted too. They just didn't know they could voice it, or they didn't know exactly what they wanted. And so coming back to the Detroit Lions, I think one of the great successes that Dan has had is he didn't bring something that the rest of the organization didn't want. They all wanted it. They just didn't have a strong enough, vulnerable enough, authentic enough leader who was willing to portray, clarify, and project the vision of where we're going and how. And the other thing that I think is so important that he did is he exuded belief in his players. There was a player, one of his, early players, and we're getting off of a tangent, but I think it's imperative here, and I think it really proves a point. They traded away their franchise quarterback, Matthew Stafford, for a quarterback who was thrown away from the organization that drafted him, Jared Goff. And if you were to look at their arc of their career over the last 5-6 years since that's happened, Jared Goff has only escalated. Matthew Stafford's had a pretty good career. He was a good player. He had won a Super Bowl, but Jared Goff has come to the pinnacle of the position. Why? Because he had someone who believed in him. He was thrown away from one organization, say, we can't win with you, and the other organization say, you're exactly the guy we need to win. And when you see that happening for the leader on your team, you see everyone else buy into that. It is exceptional. And I think it also ties into the sixth trend.
And I just want to say one more thing on that, because vulnerability, if you watch Dan Campbell, just Google his name, YouTube him. He cries, he does all the, and this man is 6'7", about 300 pounds, built like a tank, and he's crying, and he's
He's all in.
He's all in. Like, no matter how big or how small, like, this guy's a giant. And he's crying, being vulnerable, just being real. Like,
just being real.
It doesn't matter.
It's his connecting strength. So trend number 6, multi-generational leadership. Part of a couple of this, and I, teased this in the opening, we're seeing this multi-generational shift, which is leading into major organizational shift. We talked earlier about Nike. Why is that going on? Because there's an organizational generational shift. You have a newer generation that's coming in to lead. The United States, with the new leadership, yes, we have an older president, but man, if you look at his leaders that he's tapping in his cabinet are much younger. They are Gen X and millennial, because there is this generational shift in leadership. And that also brings into two things in my mind. It's a challenge of how do we lead? Because we've had these examples and we maybe haven't been shown a clear pathway. And as well, how do we make sure everyone on the outside doesn't come at us with pitchforks? Because why are you changing? Well, we're changing because we're all changing. And I think those are going to be the dynamics that is going to be very difficult. Are you going to have an older generation that's trying to stronghold and say, this is the way it's got to be? Or do they release and say, we know we have to evolve and change and grow over time? Those are the two pieces that I think are really going to be interesting here.
It's such an interesting time. So you have baby boomers, which President Trump is a baby boomer. You have Gen Xers, millennials, Gen Zers, and Gen Alphas, all in the work environment simultaneously. And you just brought this up, but I didn't really think about it. You got to give President Trump kudos, because if you look at the cabinet he's assembled, which is diverse, there's a lot of young people from business backgrounds: Kash Patel, Vivek Ramaswamy,
Elon,
his
Elsie Stefanik.
Yeah, his legal team is younger women in their early 40s. It's really, smart. He's in his 70s.
Look at his VP.
Yeah, his vice president. You missed that one. It's like so strategic. Like, he knows this is his last run. He's in his 70s. He's getting older. Let me bring in younger, smart people who know how technology and how business and how this younger workforce is really thinking. And I just, I didn't really think about that till you really mentioned it.
Well, and I think that's one of the examples to watch. Coming from a farming agriculture background, right? And I've seen it play out my whole life. You look at an older generation that owns and operates the farm, the younger generation is going to come in. I've seen it play out from my family to many of the families, many of the businesses I worked with. And some of them did it well, and some of them failed miserably. Some of them passed the baton and walked with them. Others threw the baton across the creek and into the abyss and said, good luck. And unfortunately, as I've learned from that and I've watched that, I've been a part of a business organization who has tried to do that. I've seen it done poorly, more often than I've seen it done well. And the reason why is doing it well is hard, because no different. I didn't run track. Let me just be honest. I was not fast when I was younger. I was slow. Like, I got mocked because of how slow I was. I was one of the smallest kids on the team, and I was one of the slowest. That usually does not go hand in hand. But I have learned about, track and relay races, and there is an absolute art to passing the baton, and no different in companies. And I've been lucky to sit at the feet and watch a titan in leadership and a person who I admire tremendously as far as a mentor and friend in the Maxwell Leadership Organization, John Maxwell, passing that to Mark Cole. And I can tell you firsthand from my interaction with both of them, it hasn't always been a smooth road. The very first decision Mark makes as the owner of the organization is we have to cancel our largest leadership event for the year because of COVID. It was like, it is what it was. The hard things and just like, how do you navigate? But this is what I've seen, and I've seen so well. John wants Mark to take the baton, and he's willing to guide him. And I think so often we see this multi-generational leadership, and leaders are unwilling to pass the baton. They're unwilling to give it to someone because they're afraid they might fail, and what's it going to mean for their legacy? Or they're afraid to pass the baton. And this has been one of the biggest things that I've seen happen in organizations. If I pass the baton, then what am I? Because my identity is as a leader of the organization, I am the guy. And if I pass the baton to you, Alex, then who am I? And I think that is so imperative that part of that generational shift is for younger leaders, older leaders to come down and accept what's going to be your new identity. What do you want it to be? And I think the great challenge for so many older, generations is if I pass this baton, I will no longer be relevant. And so if you're in a younger generation, you're in that spot to get the baton, I implore upon you, have something for them to do and express their value because they are still valuable, but yet you need to be running with the baton in order to finish the race.
This goes back to your previous point with Coach Dan Campbell and Jared Goff of believing in him, right? And I think there's a lot of older baby boomers and older, this generation is lazy. This generation, it's like, really, you think that? Why don't you find some people within your organization and coach them up and take them under your wing and believe in them like Dan Campbell believed in Jared Goff and lift them up and watch that magic happen because you'll have a totally different perspective because a lot of the times they just need someone to believe in them and coach them up. And I think that has to take place more often than it has been.
Man, that's such a philosophical piece is do you get more by telling someone what they're, to fix what they're bad at or celebrating what they're good at? And for many people in many different positions, they were constantly told, oh, you're not good enough, get better. And it was almost done to drive them to prove it wrong. For some people, they work like that. For many, 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 I would say overwhelmingly the greater majority others accomplish more by identifying what they're great at and helping them do more of it. I read this quote this morning, part of my morning reading, and it was from Abraham Lincoln. And he goes, a drop of honey attracts more men than a gallon of gall. Like imagine like gallbladder, like nasty bile. Like it's horrible stuff. It's stinky. And it is another reminder to say, and this was convicting to me as I'm, dealing with some of these accountability pieces in my own world. And it's like, man, just pour honey. Pour honey, pour honey, pour honey. And that is going to accomplish more than thinking you are right. And let me show you how I'm right. As I've learned, that's not empathetic. And that doesn't get you anywhere. And it's even when others aren't being empathetic to you, you have to commit to being empathetic and supporting them and walking with them.
Absolutely.
All right. One last piece. We'll wrap up. Trend number 7. We got a little bit of time. And I think this is ongoing and it only fits into everything else that we've shared is that resilience and mental health will continue to be a priority. And I believe in concert, if we do the generational change right, if we focus on our culture, if we really try to connect more with people, if we're authentic and vulnerable and empathetic, if we see the chance to be accountable, and as well, we're not just trying to put on blanket policies to fix problems. We're going to help people be more resilient, and we're also going to see their mental health improve. But this is what I know will not be the case. It will not change just because you want it to. It's only going to change through action.
Yeah. Listen, mental health it's imperative. It's highly important. I mean, I had a family a family member of mine, her boyfriend committed suicide this year. Young kid, I mean in his 20s. Just horrible, and she found him hanging. So mental health is a real problem, and continues to be. And you have to, I think from a leadership perspective, take that into consideration. Okay, and it's like everything we talked about, when you're consistently meeting these people, building real relationships, you can kind of sense those things. Whether someone's suffering from something, whether they're burnt out. And this was another interesting fact. If you're working yourself to the ground and first it's physically, then it's emotionally, then it's spiritually, you got to take a break. You got to do something where you step back and you go, enough is enough. I can't live like this. And if you're a business leader and you start feeling that, according to the World Health Organization, just this year, estimated that burnout, mental burnout, is costing businesses and productivity $1 trillion annually, with a T. 1 trillion. I mean, if you don't have a heart, but if you, just think about it, like if you're a money person, $1 trillion annually that this is affecting business and people of to that degree. It's horrible. And I think we need to continue to focus on it and keep getting better.
I think one of the great things that I understand is it's not new. As long as we have been people living and walking this earth, this has been the case. And it comes back to what practices are you doing to work through it? I shared with a friend yesterday as we were talking is being connected to who we are, what purpose we serve, what strengths we have, is the greatest tool to drive your mental health. Well, as leaders, we have the opportunity to help people through that. At the same point, looking for that, and if we create that as part of our organization, people are going to be more devoted to our organization than otherwise. And I think that's where you start to see some major resilience. You start to see some loyalty. You start to see cultures really improve when it's understanding, hey, we may make and produce whatever widget, but really we're here to serve people. That's what your job is. That's what you do as a leader. That's what every single company in this world does. When I was doing nutrition for dairy cows, I thought I was there to take care of cows. Wrong. Complete lie. I was there to serve the workers and the owners and whoever else interacted with that farm. I didn't understand that 20 years ago, and it took me a long time to learn that. But if I look back and say, oh, that's what my job was, to serve them. And I think when we look at resilience and mental health, that's the real key. Alex, as we wrap up here, I want to remind everyone that's listening, watching, 2 opportunities to engage in the community. First and foremost, the roundtable, the Impact Driven Leader Roundtable. We're taking applications right now. You can go to impactdrivenleader.com, click on Roundtable to apply for that. We will be starting those groups in February, so make sure you get your application in before then. As well, part of that, if you are a part of the roundtable, you get a VIP ticket to the Impact Driven Leader Summit, May 7th and 8th, 2025 in Spokane, Washington. You can also buy those tickets separately. Those are available. Go to impactdrivenleadersummit.com. You can probably go to both sites and have clicks to both of those. But anyways, dedicated sites. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being a part of the community. I'm going to remind you, lastly, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button, the bell to get notified whenever we release new content. If you're listening to this on Apple iTunes or Spotify or wherever you else listen, if you could rate and review this episode, I would be so appreciative. That way, more people can find out and hear in order to improve their leadership one step at a time. Thanks again for being here. Until next time, choose to lead with impact.